You might think that moral philosophers who spend their careers studying what counts as moral behavior and what makes an action or a person moral, you might think that moral philosophers would behave more morally than the average person, or than the average other professor, to take a relevant comparison group. The evidence so far, however, suggests that's not actually true. The latest episode of my podcast, Rationally Speaking, is an interview with a philosopher named Eric Schwitzgebel, who writes an excellent blog called Splintered Mind. And Eric is also something of a sociologist of philosophy. So he's studied the behavior of philosophers of ethics and other philosophers to see, to what extent are they actually living out the moral standards that they endorse. And the answer is not a lot. At least not compared to most people. What he found is that moral philosophers were significantly more likely to deem actions morally good or morally bad, but no more likely to do the morally good things or to refrain from the morally bad things than other people, at least not significantly. And he studied this using both self-report, asking people, both, do you think eating meat is wrong? And also, did you eat meat in your last meal? But also looking at objective metrics, like do moral philosophers vote in elections more often than other professors or other people? So the question is why? Why doesn't studying morality make you a more moral person? Or does it? And there's something that we're missing in the way that we're measuring moral behavior. And we go into this question in a lot of detail in the podcast, which I encourage you to check out. But I wanted to highlight one hypothesis that I came up with during the discussion, which is, I think that for, let's just call them normal people who haven't spent a long time studying and debating ethics, there's a relatively straightforward set of things that we as a society deem moral behavior. And that's not to say it's always easy to live up to that standard, but the set of things is relatively manageable, right? Don't cheat, don't steal, treat the people in your life with compassion and consideration, do unto them as you would have them do unto you. Whereas for an ethicist, or even an amateur who's spent a lot of time reading moral philosophy and thinking about the philosophy of morality, everything becomes morally permeated, as Eric put it. Not only do you have to think about how am I treating the people in my life, but you have to start thinking about how do my actions locally affect the world? How do they affect people on the other side of the world in terms of the things that I choose to buy or consume? How do they affect animals and how much moral weight do animals have? How do my actions affect future generations, people who don't even exist yet? So the scope of moral consideration becomes huge. And one effect that I think this has, just as someone who's not a professional ethicist, but who has read and thought about a lot of moral philosophy, one effect that this has is a kind of drop in the bucket effect, where you can't just decide to be moral anymore, because there's just no end to the things you could in theory be doing to be more moral. You can't just follow a sort of pre-prescribed set of rules that, if you don't cheat and you treat the people in your life well, you're a moral person. So then the question just becomes, where do you draw the line? How moral are you going to try to be? How much of this seemingly endless list of things are you going to try to live up to? So this reminded me of a phenomenon I've read about known as the telescoping effect, which has been studied by psychologists Paul Slovic as well as others, in which they've demonstrated that people's motivation to save some number of lives, like 80 lives, will vary dramatically depending on the total number of lives that could have been saved. So people are much more motivated to save 80 lives out of 100 than they are to save 80 lives out of 1,000. And it's 80 lives saved in both cases, but the proportion is much smaller when it's 80 out of 1,000, so that feels less satisfying. And I think there's something like this going on here, where the more you study ethics, or the more you think about ethics, the more ethically or morally permeated the world becomes, and the more things you realize you could theoretically do to be more moral. And so the same set of things that a normal person, a non-ethicist, is doing to be moral is still on your plate, but now it's just a small set of the set of possible things you could be doing. And so doing those things is maybe a little bit less satisfying. And I have some thoughts about how to cope with this telescoping effect, but I'll save those for a later video. Right now, I just wanted to highlight the fact that I think this phenomenon exists, and that it's a common and underappreciated motivational challenge for people who start trying to think seriously about morality and the consequences of their actions and what is really entailed in trying to behave morally. For now, I encourage you to check out this episode of the podcast with Eric Schwitzgebel. You can find it at rationallyspeakingpodcast.org.